She wants half of your retirement, Mr. Crawford's attorney said confidently, and after everything he's been through, that seems more than fair. The courtroom fell silent. My ex-husband sat at the opposite table with a smug expression that reminded me of the look he used to wear whenever he thought he had outsmarted someone. Robert Crawford was 67 years old, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, and acting as though this hearing was already over. He didn't look worried. He didn't look nervous. He looked victorious. I sat quietly beside my attorney, Linda Parker, with my hands folded in my lap. The wooden bench beneath me felt hard, but not nearly as hard as the lessons I had learned over the past 3 years. Robert glanced in my direction and gave me a small smile. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he had escaped every consequence of every choice he had ever made. For 40 years, I had known that smile better than anyone. The judge reviewed several documents while Robert's attorney continued speaking about financial hardship, fairness, and legal entitlement. Listening to those words felt surreal. Fairness, entitlement, hardship. Robert had spent months building a story that painted him as the victim. According to the documents filed with the court, he was the wronged former spouse who deserved financial support. According to his version of events, our divorce had left him struggling. According to his version, I was the fortunate one. I almost laughed. Instead, I remained silent. Silence had become one of my greatest strengths. 3 years earlier, I would have argued. I would have tried to defend myself. I would have pointed out every contradiction. But experience had taught me something valuable. The truth doesn't always need to speak immediately. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it gathers strength. Sometimes it arrives at exactly the right moment. The judge turned toward my attorney. Ms. Parker, does your client wish to respond? Linda stood calmly. Yes, Your Honor. We do. Robert leaned back in his chair, looking completely relaxed. I could almost hear his thoughts. He believed I had nothing. He believed he had prepared for every possibility. He believed the past had been buried. My eyes drifted toward the leather purse resting beside my chair. Inside was a small flash drive. It looked insignificant, ordinary, easy to overlook. Yet that tiny object carried the weight of years. It contained something Robert never imagined would surface. Something he had forgotten. Something he would have paid almost anything to keep hidden. The judge scheduled a brief recess before the next phase of the hearing. People stood and stretched. Papers shuffled. Quiet conversations filled the room. Robert crossed the aisle with the confidence of a man attending a celebration rather than a court proceeding. Helen, he said, stopping a few feet away. You know this doesn't have to be difficult. His voice sounded smooth and friendly, the same voice that had fooled neighbors, colleagues, and friends for decades. I'm sure we can settle this reasonably. I looked at him for a moment. The gray hair, the polished shoes, the practiced smile. Once upon a time, I had trusted every word he said. Once upon a time, I had believed we would grow old together. I'm not worried about it being difficult, I replied quietly. His smile faltered for less than a second before returning. Good, he said. That's good. Then he walked away. I watched him return to his table. I watched him laugh with his attorney. I watched him act like a man who had already won. Linda sat back down beside me and lowered her voice. Are you ready? She asked. I nodded. My pulse remained steady. For months, I had prepared for this day. For months, I had waited patiently while Robert built his case on half-truths and omissions. Now the moment had finally arrived. I placed a hand on my purse and felt the outline of the flash drive inside. Robert thought this hearing was about money. He thought it was about alimony. He thought he understood the game. What he didn't know was that before the day ended, everyone in that courtroom would hear something that would change everything. As I sat in that courtroom waiting for the hearing to continue, my mind drifted back to a different time, long before lawyers, court filings, and legal arguments became part of my life. There was a time when Robert and I looked like the kind of couple people admired. We married young, built a life together, and spent decades creating what I believed was a solid foundation. We bought our first home in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. It was a modest place with peeling paint and a tiny backyard, but we were proud of it. I still remember carrying boxes through the front door and imagining all the years ahead of us. Back then, we shared everything. At least, that was what I believed. While Robert focused on advancing his career, I worked part-time, raised our children, managed the household, and handled countless responsibilities that never appeared on a paycheck. I packed lunches, attended school events, balanced budgets, and stayed awake during countless nights when one of our children was sick. I did those things gladly because I believed we were building something together. As the years passed, Robert's career flourished. Promotions came. His salary increased. We moved into a larger house with 4 bedrooms and a spacious kitchen. Friends often commented on how fortunate we were. They saw vacation photos, holiday gatherings, and anniversary dinners. They saw the polished version of our marriage. What they did not see were the small changes that appeared over time. Looking back, the warning signs seem obvious. At the time, they felt insignificant. Robert became more protective of his phone. Business trips grew longer. Conversations became shorter. He spent more evenings working behind a closed office door. Whenever I asked if everything was all right, he always had an answer ready. There was always a meeting, a deadline, a client, or some new responsibility demanding his attention. I wanted to believe him. After 40 years together, trust becomes a habit. You stop questioning things because questioning them feels unnecessary. The first year after our children moved away was especially quiet. The house suddenly felt larger. Entire rooms sat unused for weeks. I thought that phase of life would bring Robert and me closer together. Instead, it seemed to create more distance. Some evenings we sat in the same room for hours without saying much. I convinced myself that every long marriage experienced seasons like that. One autumn afternoon, I stood at the kitchen window watching leaves scatter across the yard while Robert prepared for another trip. He barely looked up while packing his suitcase. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but I remember it clearly. There was a coldness in his voice that had never been there before. Not anger, not hostility, indifference. Somehow that felt worse. Months later, I would understand why. At the time, I simply told myself he was tired. People create remarkable explanations when they are trying to protect a relationship they do not want to lose. The memory faded as the courtroom door opened and people began returning to their seats. The judge was about to resume the hearing. Across the room, Robert looked confident and relaxed. He still believed the story was under his control. He still believed the past belonged to him. What he did not realize was that some truths have a way of surviving, waiting patiently until the exact moment they are needed. And the truth I carried with me that day was closer than he could possibly imagine. The hearing paused again while additional documents were organized, giving me a few quiet minutes to sit with memories I had spent years trying to understand. If there was one moment that changed the direction of my life, it was the day Samantha Blake entered it. At first, she was simply a name that appeared occasionally in conversation. Robert mentioned a new employee joining his department. He described her as talented, ambitious, and eager to learn. There was nothing unusual about that. Over the years, I had heard dozens of similar stories about coworkers and new hires. I did not pay much attention. Then her name began appearing more often. During dinner, Robert would mention a project Samantha was helping with. During weekends, he would talk about deadlines that involved her team. Small details surfaced repeatedly, like puzzle pieces scattered across a table. None of them seemed important on their own. Looking back, that was exactly why they were so easy to overlook. The first time I met Samantha was at a company holiday party. She was friendly, polite, and perfectly comfortable speaking with everyone in the room. She complimented my dress and thanked me for supporting Robert throughout his career. I remember thinking she seemed confident for someone her age. She appeared to admire Robert professionally, and I felt no reason to question her intentions. For months afterward, life continued normally, or at least it appeared to. Then subtle changes started accumulating. Robert became unusually attentive to his appearance before work. New shirts appeared in his closet. Expensive cologne appeared on the bathroom counter. His phone was never far from reach. If a notification appeared, he checked it immediately. If I walked into the room while he was reading something, the screen often went dark. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every explanation had a simple answer. Yet something about the pattern felt different. One evening, I was setting the table for dinner when Robert received a message. His phone lit up briefly on the kitchen counter. He picked it up so quickly that he nearly knocked over a glass of water. It was such a small reaction, but I noticed it. People reveal themselves in moments they believe nobody sees. Another memory stayed with me even longer. We attended a charity fundraiser downtown one spring evening. The ballroom was crowded, filled with local business leaders and community organizers. Across the room, I noticed Samantha speaking with a group of guests. The moment she saw Robert, Her expression changed. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed. But after 40 years of marriage, I knew how people looked at someone they admired. And I knew how they looked at someone who occupied far more space in their thoughts than they should. On the drive home, I almost mentioned it. Almost. Instead, I stared out the passenger window and watched streetlights pass by. Trust is a powerful thing. Sometimes it protects relationships. Sometimes it protects secrets. By the time summer arrived, I could feel an invisible distance growing between Robert and me. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was simply there, like a crack, forming beneath a foundation. Most days I convinced myself I was imagining it. Most days I chose peace over suspicion. What I did not realize was that while I was trying to preserve our marriage, someone else was quietly helping to dismantle it. And before long, a single unexpected discovery would make it impossible for me to ignore what was happening. The discovery happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was nothing dramatic about the day itself. The sky was gray. A light rain tapped against the kitchen windows. I had spent the morning running errands and returned home carrying grocery bags. Robert was supposed to be attending a conference several states away. At least that was what he had told me. I remember placing a carton of milk into the refrigerator when I noticed a garment bag hanging inside the hall closet. It was the same garment bag he always used for business travel. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I realized something strange. If he had flown out early that morning, why was the bag still here? The question lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Later that evening, while organizing paperwork in our home office, I came across an expense report Robert had accidentally left on the desk. The dates matched the trip he claimed to be taking. The location did not. Instead of another state, the charges showed a luxury hotel less than 30 miles from our home. I stared at the page for several seconds. My first reaction was confusion. There had to be an explanation. There was always an explanation. Yet this time, the familiar comfort of that belief felt weaker. For the next several days, I paid closer attention. Not because I wanted to investigate him, because I could no longer ignore the growing list of questions. Small inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. A dinner that lasted longer than expected. A meeting that changed locations at the last minute. Phone calls answered in another room. None of it proved anything. But together, the pieces began forming a picture I did not want to see. One Saturday morning, Robert stepped outside to take a call while I watered flowers on the back patio. He did not realize the kitchen window was partially open. I could not hear every word, only fragments. His tone was different, lighter, warmer, more attentive than it had been with me in years. When he returned inside, he smiled and claimed it was a client. I nodded and said nothing. By then, silence had become my companion. The following month brought our 41st wedding anniversary. For decades we had celebrated together, sometimes with expensive dinners, sometimes with simple evenings at home. That year, Robert forgot completely. He arrived after 9 o'clock, carrying takeout food and talking about deadlines. I did not remind him. I simply looked at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator and realized something important. The marriage I thought I was protecting no longer existed in the form I remembered. It had already begun slipping away. A few days later, another unexpected clue appeared. Robert left his tablet charging in the living room before heading out to meet colleagues. A notification appeared briefly on the screen. I was not trying to invade his privacy. I was walking past when I noticed a familiar name. Samantha. The message itself revealed almost nothing. Yet the timing, the frequency, and the growing pattern around it settled heavily in my thoughts. That night, while Robert slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had resisted for months. What if my instincts had been right all along? What if the distance, the secrecy, and the endless explanations were not separate problems at all? What if they were all connected? And once that question entered my mind, I could not make it leave. Once I stopped arguing with my own instincts, something inside me became calmer. Not happier, not less hurt, just clearer. For months, I had been searching for innocent explanations because I wanted to preserve the life I thought I had. Now I began paying attention to reality instead. I did not confront Robert. I did not accuse anyone. I simply observed. The more I observed, the more the truth revealed itself without assistance. A few weeks later, an opportunity appeared completely by accident. Robert told me he would be attending a weekend business retreat with several executives from his company. The explanation sounded polished and familiar. By then, I had heard dozens like it. Early Saturday morning, he left the house carrying a small suitcase and promised he would return Monday evening. I watched his car disappear down the street and felt surprisingly little emotion. Later that afternoon, I drove to a local shopping center to return a household item. As I walked through the parking lot, I noticed something that immediately stopped me. Parked near a restaurant entrance was Robert's car. At first I questioned my own eyes. Then I checked the license plate. There was no mistake. My heart began beating faster, but I forced myself to remain calm. I did not approach the restaurant. I did not create a scene. Instead, I returned to my car and sat quietly for several minutes. The facts were speaking for themselves. Robert was not attending a retreat hundreds of miles away. He was less than 20 miles from our home. That evening I made a decision that changed everything. Months earlier, I had purchased a small digital recorder for a volunteer project at our community center. The device was simple and easy to use. I had barely touched it since buying it. Now it sat inside a kitchen drawer waiting to serve an entirely different purpose. A few days after Robert returned from his supposed trip, he announced another business meeting. This one would take place at a private conference room in a downtown office building. He planned to stop there after work before joining colleagues for dinner. I listened carefully and nodded. The following afternoon, I arrived at the building earlier than expected under the pretense of delivering documents he had forgotten at home. The receptionist recognized me and directed me toward the conference area. When I arrived, the room appeared empty. Voices drifted from an adjacent meeting space, separated by a partially closed door. I froze when I recognized one of them. It was Robert. I should have walked away. Instead, I stood there for a moment, stunned by what I was hearing. Then I quietly activated the recorder in my purse. The conversation continued. Another voice joined his. Samantha. They spoke casually, assuming complete privacy. What shocked me was not merely their closeness. It was the way they spoke about me, my marriage, my future. They discussed plans, financial expectations, and assumptions about how events would unfold. At one point, Robert laughed and confidently described how easy it would be to protect his interests because, in his words, I trusted him too much to question anything. Those words settled heavily in my chest. Not because they hurt, because they confirmed everything. I remained there only long enough to capture the conversation before quietly leaving the building. That night, Robert returned home acting exactly as he always did. He asked about dinner. He watched television. He spoke about work. Meanwhile, inside my purse sat a recording that would eventually become the most important piece of evidence I had ever possessed. After that day, I stopped searching for answers because I already had them. The recording remained safely stored in multiple places, and for the first time in months, I felt something I had not experienced in a long while. Certainty. Not certainty about what would happen next, but certainty about what had already happened. The confusion was gone. The endless questioning was gone. I knew the truth. What surprised me most was how ordinary life continued to look from the outside. Robert still came home every evening carrying the same briefcase. He still discussed work over dinner. He still asked routine questions about errands, bills, and family updates. If someone had visited our house during that period, they probably would have assumed everything was normal. That illusion lasted only a few more weeks. One evening, Robert asked if we could talk. His tone was unusually formal. We sat at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals over 4 decades. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. I already knew what was coming before he spoke. I think we both know things have changed, he said carefully. I do not think this marriage is working anymore. I listened quietly. There was no shock. Left to feel. He continued speaking about growing apart, different goals, and the need for a fresh start. The explanations sounded polished, almost rehearsed. Not once did he mention Samantha. Not once did he mention the months of deception. Instead, he presented the end of our marriage as an unfortunate but mutual evolution. When he finished, I simply nodded. His expression revealed genuine surprise. I think he expected tears. Perhaps he expected an argument. Maybe he expected me to fight for the relationship. What he received instead was calm acceptance. If that is your decision, I said, then I understand. For a moment, he looked almost uncomfortable. Silence can be unsettling when someone expects resistance. Within 2 months, he moved out. Within 4 months, the divorce proceedings began. Throughout the process, Robert remained remarkably confident. His attorneys handled most communications. Financial disclosures were exchanged. Assets were evaluated. Agreements were negotiated. I cooperated fully. I answered every request. I never mentioned the recording. Not to Robert. Not to his attorneys. Not even to most of my friends. The recording became my insurance policy, quietly waiting in the background. The divorce was eventually finalized. By then, Samantha was no longer a secret. Robert appeared publicly with her at restaurants, community events, and social gatherings. Word spread quickly. Some people expressed sympathy. Others avoided discussing it altogether. I focused on rebuilding my life. I joined community programs, spent more time with friends, and slowly adjusted to a future I had never expected to face alone. Then something unexpected happened. Nearly a year after the divorce became final, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside were legal documents that immediately caught my attention. Robert was seeking financial support from me. According to the filing, changes in his circumstances justified additional payments. I read the paperwork twice, hardly believing what I was seeing. After everything that had happened, he wanted more. I placed the documents on my kitchen table and stared at them for several minutes. Then I opened a drawer, removed a small flash drive, and set it beside the papers. That was the moment I finally called attorney Linda Parker. And after she listened to what was stored on that recording, her first words told me everything I needed to know. Linda listened to the recording twice before saying anything. The first time, she focused on the conversation itself. The second time, she took notes. When the audio ended, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Helen," she said calmly, "this changes the entire picture." Those words stayed with me for months. From that point forward, every decision was deliberate. Linda advised patience. She explained that timing mattered almost as much as evidence. We would respond to every filing properly. We would follow every legal procedure. Most importantly, we would allow Robert to continue presenting the version of events he wanted the court to believe. That strategy was not easy. As the hearing date approached, I received copies of documents outlining Robert's claims. According to his filings, he was facing financial difficulties. According to his statements, he needed support because circumstances had changed significantly since the divorce. Reading those pages felt surreal. I knew facts that never appeared in those documents. I knew conversations that had taken place behind closed doors. Yet I remained silent because Linda repeatedly reminded me that the courtroom was the place for truth, not emotional arguments. The weeks passed quickly. Friends occasionally asked about the case, but I revealed very little. I had learned that people often confuse talking with progress. Sometimes the strongest position is the quietest one. Meanwhile, Robert appeared more confident than ever. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard stories about vacations, expensive dinners, and social events. Samantha remained by his side. Together, they projected the image of a couple enjoying a successful new chapter. If Robert felt concerned about the upcoming hearing, he hid it well. The morning of the hearing arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. I arrived at the courthouse early with Linda. She carried several folders neatly organized inside a leather briefcase. I carried my purse. Inside it rested the flash drive that had become the center of everything. Before entering the courtroom, Linda looked at me and asked a simple question. "Are you ready?" I surprised myself by answering honestly, "Yes." And I was. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted Robert humiliated. I was ready because I was tired of watching dishonesty present itself as truth. Inside the courtroom, Robert greeted several people warmly. He looked relaxed, comfortable, certain. Samantha sat behind him in the gallery, dressed professionally and smiling occasionally at those around her. The confidence they projected would have impressed anyone who did not know the full story. Once proceedings began, Robert's attorney delivered a polished presentation. Financial concerns were emphasized. Personal challenges were described. Several statements portrayed Robert as someone deserving sympathy and assistance. Throughout the presentation, I remained completely still. Occasionally, Robert glanced in my direction. Each time, he seemed reassured by my silence. I think he interpreted it as weakness. I think he believed I had accepted the inevitable outcome. Then one witness after another supported various parts of his narrative. The story grew stronger with every passing minute, at least on the surface. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of testimony, the judge turned toward Linda. "Counselor, does your client wish to present additional evidence?" The room became noticeably quieter. Linda rose slowly from her chair. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "We do." Then she reached into her briefcase and removed an item nobody on the other side seemed prepared to see. In that instant, for the first time all day, Robert's confident expression began to change. The object Linda placed on the evidence table looked almost insignificant. A simple flash drive, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Yet the reaction it triggered was immediate. I watched Robert's eyes lock onto it. For the first time that day, uncertainty appeared on his face. It lasted only a moment before he regained his composure, but I saw it. Linda requested permission to introduce newly submitted evidence related directly to statements made during the proceedings. After reviewing several documents, the judge granted the request. Robert's attorney objected briefly, arguing procedural concerns, but the judge allowed the evidence to be considered. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Linda connected the recording to the courtroom audio system. I could hear the faint hum of the speakers activating. My hands remained folded in my lap. Months earlier, I had imagined this moment countless times. Now that it had arrived, I felt surprisingly calm. The recording began. At first, only ordinary background sounds filled the room. Chairs moving, distant voices. Then Robert's voice became clear. There was no confusion about who was speaking. No uncertainty about the identity of the person on the recording. Everyone in the courtroom recognized it immediately. His words echoed through the speakers with remarkable clarity. As the conversation continued, expressions around the room began to change. The confidence Robert had displayed throughout the hearing slowly disappeared. The recording revealed details that directly contradicted several claims presented earlier. More importantly, it revealed his attitude toward the situation long before the divorce occurred. He spoke openly about plans, expectations, and assumptions that painted a very different picture from the one his legal filings described. Samantha's voice appeared as well. Together, they discussed matters they clearly believed would never become public. Certain statements caused several people in the gallery to exchange glances. Others simply stared forward in silence. The judge listened carefully without interruption. Robert's attorney stopped taking notes and focused entirely on the audio. The longer the recording played, the heavier the atmosphere became. Then came the portion that changed everything. Robert laughed during the conversation and confidently described how easily he expected future financial matters to work in his favor. He spoke about my trust. He spoke about assumptions he believed would protect him. He spoke with the certainty of someone who never expected accountability. The words were not angry. They were not emotional. In many ways, that made them more powerful. They were calm, deliberate, and entirely his own. When the recording finally ended, silence filled the courtroom. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The absence of sound seemed louder than the recording itself. The judge reviewed notes before looking toward Robert's attorney. "Would your client like to address the contents of this evidence?" she asked. Robert shifted in his seat. The confident posture he had maintained throughout the day was gone. His attorney requested a brief recess. The request was granted. As people stood and quietly exited the courtroom, I remained seated. Across the room, Samantha looked visibly unsettled. Robert avoided eye contact with nearly everyone around him. For years, he had controlled the narrative. For years, he had decided which version of events others would hear. Now his own voice had become the strongest witness in the room. Linda leaned toward me and spoke softly. "The truth is doing exactly what it is supposed to do." I nodded without responding. Because at that moment, everyone finally understood what Robert had spent years trying to hide, and the final decision was now only a matter of time. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt completely different. Earlier that morning, Robert had entered the room like a man expecting a routine victory. Now he looked exhausted. The confidence that had carried him through months of legal filings and carefully prepared statements had vanished. His attorney made several attempts to minimize the importance of the recording, but the problem was impossible to overcome. The evidence did not come from an outside witness. It did not come from speculation or assumptions. It came directly from Robert's own voice. The judge asked additional questions. Financial records were reviewed again. Prior statements were compared against the contents of the recording. With each clarification, the contradictions became more difficult to explain. I sat quietly beside Linda and watched the process unfold. For years, I had imagined what justice might look like. I used to think it would feel dramatic or emotional. Instead, it felt surprisingly calm. The truth was finally standing on its own. It no longer needed me to defend it. Several days later, the court issued its decision. Robert's request was denied. The ruling cited concerns about credibility, inconsistencies in testimony, and evidence presented during the hearing. When Linda called to share the news, I thanked her and placed the phone down on my kitchen table. Then I sat in silence for a few minutes. Not because I was celebrating, because I was finally finished carrying a burden that had followed me for years. News of the hearing spread quickly through social circles that Robert and I had once shared. People who had only heard one version of the story suddenly learned there was much more to it. Some reached out to apologize for assumptions they had made. Others simply stopped contacting Robert altogether. I did not encourage those conversations. I did not share details. I did not seek validation. Everyone was free to reach their own conclusions. As for Samantha, I heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. The relationship that had once seemed so certain apparently faced challenges of its own. Eventually, the updates became less frequent. Then they stopped entirely. I never investigated further. By then, other people's choices no longer occupied much space in my life. My attention was focused elsewhere. I started traveling more. I visited national parks I had always wanted to see. I spent time with old friends. I volunteered at community programs and reconnected with hobbies I had neglected for years. Gradually, the future stopped feeling intimidating and started feeling open. One afternoon, nearly a year after the hearing, I found the flash drive while organizing a drawer. For several moments, I simply looked at it resting in my hand. Such a small object, such an enormous impact. Then I placed it inside a storage box and closed the lid. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The recording had never destroyed Robert. The court had not destroyed him either. The consequences he faced were created by decisions he made long before anyone pressed play on that audio file. That realization brought me more peace than any courtroom victory ever could. Sometimes people ask how I managed to remain so calm throughout everything that happened. The answer is simple. Eventually, I learned that truth does not need anger to be powerful. It does not need revenge to be effective. It only needs the opportunity to be heard. On a warm spring evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky shades of gold and orange. The air was quiet. The future felt light. And for the first time in many years, I realized I was no longer looking backward. I was finally moving